My name is Major Kensing Colby. On December 2nd, 2056, I set out alone from the German space station Ehrgeizhs in a gray-class single-seat locator, headed toward the Bessarabia sector to complete a brief recovery mission on Teltran. 2 weeks earlier, Ellen Hernandez had died there when her spacesuit was torn by a flying shard of irradiated coolant released by an explosion on one of Russia's nuclear-powered satellites. The other members of her crew had had to take off for their own safety from the freak storm, and her body hadn't been recovered yet. Teltran was a desert void that had aggravated both DLR and NASA for years now, with its maddening and conflicting soil evidence of a water source that was probably never going to be found. Ellen Hernandez had been collecting ever more samples when the coolant storm killed her. All that was left now was the slow pulse of the positioning chip embedded in her left boot heel. It was this that I followed all the way down to the vast, arid surface. It was almost entirely an instrument landing. I kicked up so much toxic soil as I descended that too much of it got sucked into both main engines and played hell with the craft's heating core, but this was only a minor annoyance. It was a relatively smooth operation. When I was firmly down, I revved up the beacon lights and napped for the 10 minutes they took to gain full power. Turning each one on to flood the surrounding square mile with pale, sickly illumination produced an impressively loud series of metallic clanking sounds, 12 of them in all, inside the craft. Then there was just that oppressive silence that cloaked Teltran and everything else out in the deep reaches of space. Teltran's atmosphere of nitrogen, argon, and belclarium discolored the white light of the beacons into a muddy, rusty red. Just a flat, empty plane through the forward window. Same through the rear. I'd calculated my position pretty well, and on monitor 8, I could see a good clean image of the area around the craft. Ellen Hernandez's body was there, face up on the plane. The image was so clear I could see where her suit and her body had been torn, right at her waist on the left side. A big tear, too. Bloody. The shard of coolant that had done it might have been traveling at 200 miles per hour or more. I saw no actual coolant debris anywhere. It was long gone by now. Well past Eldrinda, probably. I had a full 20 hours or so before the atmosphere began to freeze the ignition seams inside the engine, so I took the time to eat something before I headed out. After that, I began the process of donning and securing my suit and prepping the cart which would carry Hernandez back to the craft. It was not quite noon Ehrgeizhs time when I checked in with the station and then went through the unlock sequence and opened the hatch to allow me onto the surface of Teltran. Never before had I been completely alone on a mass such as this, even though I'd been trained for it. The silence and the darkness could be psychologically damaging if you weren't prepared for it. Human beings aren't wired to be plunged into that kind of isolation. Now, at any time I could open communications with the Ehrgeizhs by merely speaking aloud inside my helmet, but since they had me hitched to a biotrack, I didn't feel the need. The cart followed me as I stepped onto the planet's thin soil and into that bath of red light. It was only a 5-minute walk to the body. When I reached her, I crouched down and excised the tracker from her boot so Ron Railsberg could look at the data and maybe learn a tiny bit more about how quickly she died. I could see one side of her face through her faceplate. Her left eye was open. I looked away off at the incredibly tiny pinpricks of stars. I'd never actually touched a corpse before. I was about to start adjusting the cart to automatically scoop her up when one of the beacon lights died. Not that I didn't expect it. It changed the nature of the glow around me in a very subtle way. And that was enough to plunge that feeling into me like an ice pick. That feeling of being impossibly far from any living presence and less than a speck of helpless breath and being. It was like waking up in a coffin. And it only lasted an instant before up went the mental wall that blocked out the scary reality of the moment. I wasn't about to freeze up or panic like some did during the sensory deprivation tests back at Langley. I noticed something in the distance. At the very, very edge of the beacon light's reach. The point where that red glow finally dissolved into nothingness. At first it looked to me like the edge of a rock formation, an anomaly on the otherwise blank landscape. We knew that such formations were fairly common. The unusual shape of some of them was what gave some of us hope of a water source. But as my vision adjusted, I realized it was not a rock formation. Not at all. I walked past the corpse toward that place where the light faded to black. I stopped 20 yards later and just stood and stared. What I was looking at was the back of a school bus. Yes. A traditional school bus, facing away from me. Each step brought me more detail. 30 more yards and I could read the Colorado license plate. A number on the rear emergency door marked the bus. Bus number 68. The front half of it was totally in the dark. I don't remember how long I stood there, 3 feet from the back of the bus, before I went forward into that patch of black emptiness. I did not question the reality of what I was seeing, not for a moment. Whether it was real or imagined didn't enter into my course of action. I reached my left hand out and felt for the side of the bus with my glove. With my right, I reached up to the trip which would disconnect any incoming transmissions from the air guys. I wanted the silence now, and this cut off even the tiny static hum of the open channel. I soon came to an obstruction. The bus's accordion door was open, and I positioned myself where the steps would lead me up and in. But it was a long time before I climbed them. You see, never before had the door been open. Not 12 years ago when the bus had first appeared to me in my hometown of St. Augustine, and not 4 years ago when I'd followed it at 2 a.m. to an open field, after it had actually passed me on Bailey Ridge Road, 70 miles outside of Denver. My will to approach it, as it sat in that field, had failed me badly that night. Bad enough to send me to the closest bar I could find, where I drank myself into oblivion. The open door told me this would be the end of it. They finally wanted me aboard. I had just enough willpower to look back toward my craft once more, and even if I'd had the strength to go towards it, I couldn't anyway, because Ellen Hernandez was now standing on the spot where she'd lain, standing there as if to keep me from going back. She had removed her helmet. The Belclarium had sucked all the moisture from her flesh, so her face, what little I could see of it, looked cracked all over. Her eyes vanished into their sockets. Most of her hair had fallen out. Both of her legs were covered in blood. It was an effort in that atmosphere just to lift each leg high enough to maneuver into the tight space at the bus's entry point. The bulk of my suit brushed on what felt like handrails on either side of me. I was utterly blind and deaf. But then, when I turned my body to the left upon ascending 2 steps, the red glow of the distant beacon lights showed me the silhouettes of human beings sitting in the bus's seats, or should I say, just their heads and shoulders. 14 of them there were. Many of the seats were empty. They wanted me to be among them. It was time. I shuffled a few steps forward. I sensed, rather than saw, a head turn slightly to watch me pass. I steadied myself by touching the backs of the seats. A few feet from the end of the aisle, I maneuvered clumsily into one of them. I sat toward the edge, facing the front. Across the aisle were the obsidian outlines of 2 people who I felt were staring at me, eyes invisible. I was 20 years old when I caused the accident that took all their lives, and the drivers, who hadn't been much older than I was. A quarter of a century ago now. It had been a day trip for them, an outing from the senior center on Ronstick Road where they passed their quiet days. None was under 70 years old. I'd cut the bus off in my Honda as I was trying to pass a slow-moving sedan in the rain. It had all happened in an instant. I never saw the bus swerve and then overcompensate, sending it onto the shoulder and then across the opposing lane toward a drop of 40 feet beyond a rusty guardrail. I had driven on, assuming I had merely caused a bit of a jolt. It was only later that I learned what had become of them. Their day trip to Lake Edmund had been the last of their lives. I had never told anyone, what had happened. I'd even managed to somehow pass NASA's psych evals, maybe because it took years for the guilt to sink in so deeply that it never left. But this wasn't enough for the people on the school bus. They wanted to stretch my suffering out across the decades. After 5 minutes, maybe 10 of sitting there on the bus, insensate and numb, I felt we were moving. The bus had begun to roll forward. I closed my eyes and leaned back against my seat. It couldn't really be called terror, what I was feeling. My conscious mind had finally detached from the desire for self-preservation entirely. I lost all awareness at one point and fell into a dreamless abyss, much like they'd once told me hypersleep would be like. When I awoke, nothing had changed except that through the front window of the bus, I could see a deep band of blue in the sky, telling me the impossible that we had traversed thousands of miles of dead terrain and were on the other side of Tiltron now. That vast blue band brought out the silhouettes of those sitting in front of me, as well as the driver, who kept both hands assuredly on the wheel as we rolled forward at 15 or 20 miles per hour. Time spun out. Once every few hours we went past a rock formation or a strange slope that broke up the void. At its very brightest, that blue band brought enough light into the bus that I could see my gloves, and finally, some small details of the faces of the old couple sitting across the aisle from me. Their eyes were riveted directly forward, their haggard faces without expression or expectation. And so we drove, and drive even now, ceaselessly across Teltron. I suppose time has never actually moved, and no one will be coming down from the air guys to rescue me, ever. Sometimes the total darkness returns completely for what feels like days at a time. Sometimes the light is there. I see new features on the landscape through the windows once in a while, but while the scientists of the air guys still have a dim hope of finding a water source here, those on the bus will never find the one they sought 26 years ago. Twice the bus has stopped entirely, and I could just make out the driver poring over a road map, maybe growing more and more frustrated about Lake Edmund's whereabouts, and not understanding why reaching it is impossible. I intend to meet my fate honorably, and I have no intention of ever rising from my seat. I'll wait for as long as it takes for some final act to kill me mercifully, or at least give me a glimpse of a future beyond space, time, and torment.